These were the most gruesome torture methods in human history. Number 5. The Iron Maiden. So, picture this. A tall, human-shaped coffin made entirely of iron. But here's the twist. It's not just a coffin. The inside is lined with sharp, metal spikes, carefully positioned to pierce your body when the doors are shut. Now, these weren't meant to just stab you willy-nilly. Oh no. The spikes were strategically placed to avoid major organs, like the heart or brain, so you wouldn't die immediately. Instead, you'd bleed out slowly over hours or even days in unimaginable pain. The Iron Maiden wasn't just about the physical agony. It was also psychological. Imagine standing in front of this terrifying contraption, knowing what's about to happen. The anticipation alone would be enough to drive someone to madness. Here's how it supposedly went down. The victim would be forced into the Iron Maiden, standing upright, and the torturer would slowly close the door. As the spikes pushed into the flesh, they wouldn't immediately kill. Instead, they'd puncture areas like the arms, legs, abdomen, and even the face. Some versions of the Iron Maiden reportedly had spikes placed to pierce the eyes, which, yeah, let that sink in. To make matters worse, some accounts suggest they would leave the victim locked inside for hours or even days, letting the wounds fester. And as if that wasn't enough, there were sometimes small holes in the device, allowing the torturers to hear the victim's screams and prolong the psychological torment. But here's the plot twist. Did the Iron Maiden actually exist as a real torture device? Well, historians are split on this one. The truth is, there's little evidence that the Iron Maiden was actually used during the medieval period. Most of the examples we see today, like in museums, were actually made later, in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some experts think the Iron Maiden was more of a symbol of medieval cruelty than a practical tool. It may have been created during the Renaissance as a way to show how barbaric people were in earlier times. Basically, a propaganda piece to say, look how far we've come. But whether it was real or not, the idea of the Iron Maiden was enough to strike fear into people's hearts. Number 4. The bamboo torture. Bamboo is one of the fastest growing plants on the planet. Under the right conditions, it can grow almost an inch per hour. That's wild, right? Now imagine if someone figured out how to turn that relentless growth into a method of slow, excruciating torture. According to legend, that's exactly what happened. The idea was simple, but absolutely horrifying. The victim, let's say a prisoner of war or someone being punished, would be tied down flat, usually on their back, over a young bamboo shoot. They'd be secured so they couldn't move, escape, or even squirm much. At first, it probably seemed like nothing major, just some shoots of bamboo sticking out of the ground. But as the hours turned into days, something terrifying started to happen. The bamboo began to grow, and not just around the victim, it grew into them. Bamboo is insanely tough, almost like wood, and it grows with a pointed tip. As it shoots up, it doesn't care what's in its way. Flesh, muscle, bone, none of it stands a chance against the sheer force of bamboo's growth. Over time, the shoots would pierce the skin and slowly work their way up through the body, inch by inch. And here's the kicker. This process wasn't quick. It could take days, maybe even a week. So the victim was alive and conscious for a good chunk of the ordeal, forced to endure the unimaginable pain of being skewered by nature itself. What makes this even more horrifying is the psychological aspect. Imagine lying there, unable to move, knowing exactly what's happening to you, but being completely powerless to stop it. You'd hear the bamboo creaking and snapping as it grew, feel the pressure building under your skin, and know that the only way out was, well, you get the idea. Number 3. The rack? It's the Middle Ages. Life is already rough. Plagues, wars, no Wi-Fi. Now imagine you've been accused of something like heresy, witchcraft, or just annoying the wrong person in power. You're dragged into a dungeon, the smell of damp stone and fear in the air, and there it is, the rack. What is the rack, you ask? Picture this. A massive wooden frame, kind of like a long bed, but instead of a comfy mattress, you've got 2 rotating rollers on each end. Your hands and feet are tied with ropes to these rollers, locking you in place. Once you're strapped in, the torturer starts turning a crank, and bam, your body starts stretching. Sounds bad already, right? Oh, it gets worse. Let's break it down. When the rollers turn, they pull your arms and legs in opposite directions. At first, you might feel like you're just doing a really intense yoga stretch, but then your joints start to pop. First your shoulders, then your hips. You're basically being pulled apart like some medieval Stretch Armstrong toy. And here's the horrifying part. This wasn't just about pain. The idea was to completely dislocate your body while keeping you alive. Yeah, it's nightmare fuel. Now you might be wondering, who thought this was a good idea? The rack dates back to ancient times, but it really hit its peak in medieval Europe, especially during the Inquisition. It was the go-to tool for extracting confessions. The logic was simple. If they made it hurt enough, you'd tell them anything they wanted to hear, true or not. Need someone to admit to witchcraft? Crank the rack. Want to expose a secret rebellion? Crank it some more. But here's the thing. Medieval torturers weren't exactly subtle. Sometimes they didn't stop at stretching you to the limit. Nope. They'd crank it until your tendons and ligaments tore, your muscles ripped apart, and your body was a mess of agony. Some racks even had spikes underneath, so you'd be getting stabbed while being stretched. And if that wasn't enough, some versions were heated with fire. Imagine being slowly roasted while your body's being pulled apart. Yeah, these guys were creative, but not in a good way. Number 2, scaphism. You're in ancient Persia, and you're about to witness the most horrifying punishment ever devised. So here's how it goes down. You're trapped inside 2 boats or hollowed-out tree trunks, completely immobilized, helpless. But it gets way worse. They force-feed you milk and honey until you're incredibly sick, then cover your body with more milk and honey. Why? Because that sticky mess attracts flies, maggots, and all sorts of bugs that just love to feast on rotting flesh. And here's the twist. They leave your face, hands, and feet exposed for the bugs to go crazy on you. But that's not the worst part. You're left floating in stagnant water, baking under the sun, slowly rotting away as insects crawl into your wounds and maggots eat at your flesh. You're stuck there, days turning into weeks, suffering from dehydration, infection, and pure agony. Sounds like a nightmare, right? But here's where it gets real. There's a true story about a man named Shar Mithridates, who was actually tortured by this. History tells us that he was subjected to scaphism after falling out of favor with the Persian king. The man was force-fed, trapped in the boats, and left to rot under the sun. The torture went on for days, and eventually, he died from the overwhelming pain and the relentless attacks from insects. His body, once a living man, became a breeding ground for bugs until death finally ended his suffering. This wasn't just a punishment, it was meant to be an excruciating spectacle. The Persians created scaphism to make death seem like a never-ending torment. It was terrifyingly effective in instilling fear in anyone who dared to break their laws. So stay curious, but maybe don't look up scaphism at dinner. Number 1. Lingchi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a gruesome form of execution used in imperial China, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties. It was reserved for those convicted of serious crimes like treason, murder, or other offenses deemed unforgivable. The process was incredibly slow and painful. The condemned person would be bound to a wooden frame or pillar in a public place, often for all to see. The executioner would then start making small, deliberate cuts across the person's body, usually starting with less critical areas like arms and legs. These cuts were designed to cause extreme pain and massive blood loss, but were spaced out so that the victim wouldn't die immediately. The whole idea behind lingchi was to prolong the victim's suffering over a period of hours. The cuts would continue, sometimes targeting the face, genitals, or torso, until the person eventually succumbed to blood loss, shock, or organ failure. The execution was drawn out deliberately, often for hours, to maximize the pain and humiliation. This method of execution wasn't just about punishing the individual, it was also a public spectacle meant to deter others from committing serious crimes. It sent a clear message about the cruelty of the punishment and the power of the emperor. In some cases, the executioner would sever the head at the end to hasten the death, but the most important part was the slow, excruciating process that made lingchi infamous. Lingchi was abolished in 1905 by the Qing dynasty as part of broader reforms, but its legacy lives on in history as one of the most horrific forms of punishment ever used. It serves as a grim reminder of the brutal methods once employed by states to enforce law and order through fear and cruelty. That's all, guys. Please like and subscribe, and can you please suck my cock?